Welcome to the Foreign Policy Week in Review with Daniel McAdams of the Ron Paul Institute for Peace and Prosperity. Welcome, Daniel. It's good to have you with me again, and Happy New Year to you.
Happy New Year, Jay. It's great to be back with you again after our short break.
Yeah, it's well, we need a break once in a while, for sure. And the kind of things that we talk about on this show, I just think for our mental health, we have to get away from it for a little bit because there are a lot of very disturbing things. Of course, you know, we could just look at the world and fail to deal with reality. We could just pretend that the mainstream media has it correct and that they are giving us everything that's truthful. And we don't really have to worry about anything because we just trust our establishment. We just trust our government. We just trust that all the people that are in positions of elite positions of power are really caring for us, Daniel, that they really love us. Why should we ever doubt them? I guess we could take that approach, which I think is probably the approach that a lot of Americans take. It is an easier way to go. And then until all hell breaks loose, I suppose, life might be easier. But some of us choose to try to look at reality as it really is and try to ask some hard questions when things don't add up. And I really appreciate that about you and your boss, Ron Paul, and other people that we have on this show on a regular basis. So let's talk about some of the leading headlines and some of the things that are taking place right now, but some of the leading headlines at the Ron Paul Institute for Peace and Prosperity, as we like to talk about every week. First off, I understand that Obama has announced some sanctions against North Korea relating to the alleged tampering of of America, of Sony, essentially, by the North Koreans. What can you tell us about that story?
I think it's just the most remarkable development. On Friday, President Obama announced that 10 unnamed North Koreans would fall under U.S. sanctions for their role in hacking into Sony's computers. Now, Sony is a Japanese company, and I know it has a U.S. Component, but it's a Japanese company. The administration, if you remember, when Sony's computers were first first hacked, the administration immediately jumped out and said North Korea did it.
Yeah,
and this is very familiar to a lot of Americans now who are becoming more and more skeptical about U.S. claims. They immediately jump out and say, you know, North Korea did it, or with the Malaysia Airlines shoot down, Putin did it, you know, or with the chemical weapons attack a couple of last year in Syria, it was Assad did it. You know, they jump out immediately and say these things
without any time to have examined the evidence.
No time examining the evidence or nothing. And so here's Obama right after this hacking of Sony. The North Koreans did it. The FBI said, we're certain that the North Koreans did it. And there's some assumption that there's some pressure on the FBI placed by the White House on this. But then in a couple of days after these claims, you started hearing more and more from people who are actually experts in cyber terrorism and in cyber security. And there were, I don't remember exactly how many, but there were a handful of leading firms, you know, who investigated the forensic evidence from these hack attacks, and they came to the conclusion that there is just absolutely no evidence that North Korea did it at all. Huh. The evidence that had been cited to blame North Korea was very, very sketchy at best. It had to do with some borrowed code that hackers all over, they share this malicious code, so that didn't tie it to North Korea. And they actually went to the FBI, these cybersecurity firms. They went to brief the FBI on their findings that, hey, look, the evidence does not point in the direction that you've claimed. And this has all happened within the past few days. And so the speculation up until Friday, literally, was how is the administration going to back down from jumping ahead of the game yet once again and making claims for which it has no evidence, and for which subsequently the evidence points in a different direction. And that was the question up until just very, very recently. And now it turns out that, as usual, the U.S. government, not only does it not back down when its claims are called into question, but it actually doubles down on its original false claims. So I like reading Tyler Durden, who does Zero Hedge, and he says that U.S. foreign policy has just jumped the shark. You know.
Wow. Yeah. Well, it's incredible, but you know, I remember Jeff Dice, Ron Paul's chief of staff, saying, "Jay, you don't understand. perception is reality in politics. So if you, I mean, Daniel McAdams says something, who's not as well known as President Obama. Obama can get on television and just say it and say it and say it again, and people will start to believe that that's the truth. And who is Daniel McAdams, or who are these other guys?
Yeah, sure, exactly.
Who are these other guys that are these so-called experts? Well, that's just probably some propaganda from the wrong side of the tracks.
Yeah, they're being paid by someone.
They're being paid by somebody, and I mean, it's so.
But you know, Jay, I'm sorry to interrupt you. Go ahead.
No, you go ahead.
I was just going to say that this whole hacking of this Sony company is so bizarre because the U.S. claims it was over a so-called comedy movie that that shows the North Korean leader being killed by two goofy Americans, I guess, you know.
Yeah.
And the U.S. government portrayed it as that, you know, that the leader of North Korea is so incensed by this film that he had his evil minions hack the Sony pictures and cause this film and basically blackmail Sony into not showing the film. You know, which is it's such a bizarre suggestion. But you know what? I think the real news that came out of this whole thing was that Sony Pictures actually went to the State Department and the White House, and actually the Rand Corporation, which is very close to the Pentagon, and said, hey, we're going to put together a film showing the assassination of the North Korean leader. Is that okay with you? And the U.S. blessed it, said, sure, that sounds like a good idea to put in the film. So that's very bizarre on two things. First of all, that a private company would go to the U.S. government and seek approval.
Yeah, why do they do that to start with?
And second of all, what business does the U.S. government have in approving or unapproving films that may or may not have some propaganda value on American citizens? You know, as you know, Jay, most Americans get their news and their history from these sort of entertainment shows like the Colbert Show and Jon Stewart. This to them is reality. So if you can manipulate popular culture, then you've scored a huge propaganda victory against Americans. And so now we've seen right out spread before us how Hollywood colludes with the U.S. government to deliver films that present a propaganda message to the American people. And I think that's the real chilling part of this whole episode. Yeah,
isn't it though? Yeah, I hadn't thought of that. That is chilling, and you know, so much for free speech, I guess. It's all about, you know, and again, it's just this sort of these false flags, seemingly false flags that are flying every which way these days that are very, very troublesome, I think. And this looks like another one. It's incredible that there are though still enough freedom out there for people to speak their minds, but again, it's perception. So if you have the right people saying, telling the lies, people will believe it, I guess, or most people will. Clearly, yeah.
So I was just going to say, and the real irony even is that the White House framed this whole thing as a free speech issue. We're not going to let a foreign dictator decide what Americans can see and what they cannot see.
Right. Yeah. I mean, it's just incredible. What's up is down, and what's down is up. It's just everything. It seems to be so much the way things are these days. It is really disturbing to see how the propaganda machinery can take truth, can take lies and turn them into truth all the time. It's just incredible.
Yeah, and it's a big benefit for Sony too, because it was from what the reviews say, it was an absolutely idiotic film that nobody would have otherwise seen. But since it's made into this huge free speech issue, everyone wanted to have a look at it. So it's a win-win for them too.
Yeah. Well, it's maybe the whole thing was pre-organized. Who knows? And it's crazy. Well, you know, perception and propaganda. That's the name of the game. Is, you know. Perception is truth in the political world, and Mr. Obama now is telling us that he's really fulfilling his campaign promises to wind things down in Afghanistan, bring the troops home. I see in the Ron Paul piece, the ERPI website here, Afghanistan war reaches $1 trillion and will require hundreds of billions more, and yet the president seems to be, again, the perception from the president is that he is really a very peaceful man who's bringing people home and reducing the war efforts of the United States in Afghanistan. How do you see it?
Yeah, well, he announced over the holidays that this is the end of military of combat activities in Afghanistan, and it really some observers said this is really his mission accomplished moment. If you remember back when President Bush was on the battleship with the mission accomplished banner, and as a matter of fact, the war had not even started by then.
Horrible joke.
Yeah, horrible joke. And so here's Obama really doing the same thing. He's announced that the combat mission is over. The inference, of course, being that we won, whereas the reality is very, very different. First of all, the U.S. will retain, I think, more than 10,000 combat troops in Afghanistan. The president secretly allowed them to be involved in far more combat activities this coming year than he had originally promised, and we had an article on that as well. And thirdly, and this is also a big thing, in addition to the 10,000, I think there would be close to 40,000 contractors, Blackwater types, who will remain in Afghanistan, whose actions will not be publicized. They work in secret. If they're killed, it's secret, and they're paid, of course, largely by U.S. aid to Afghanistan. So they add that together, and you've got about 50,000 Western troops that remain in Afghanistan, and you've got a Taliban which is really ready to claim its final victory in Afghanistan. It's only a matter of time before we see another Vietnam moment, with the helicopter leaving the embassy.
Yeah, but I mean, the point is that it won't be televised, though, will it, Daniel?
No, it won't, because we've already had our specially framed victory moment.
Right. I mean, it's unlike Vietnam. And remember, we don't hear about body counts anymore. I guess maybe in part because it's a quote unquote voluntary military now. Whereas during Vietnam, people were drafted and people were mad as hell about coming back maimed or having loved ones come back dead. And there were body counts in those days.
Yeah.
There was, we saw televised accounts of this one Vietnam person being blown away. We saw the horrors of war during Vietnam. We don't see any of that anymore, do we? It's not allowed. We're not allowed to see that anymore. We're not allowed to know the ugliness of war. The fact that 500,000 children were killed in Iraq.
Yeah.
Maybe 1 million people died, mostly innocent people or people that were not part of the military establishment there. I mean, we're just not allowed to know the truth about what's really going on anymore in the world, it seems.
And a perfect example is Libya. Who's talking about Libya these days? Nobody has noticed the fact that the country is an absolute disaster after the U.S. intervention that overthrew the leader Gaddafi. It's where they had their victory lap, the U.S. and all of these self-righteous human rights people in the U.S. government and in the NGOs said how wonderful it is that we got rid of a dictator. And then when the place turns out to be 100 times worse than even under the dictator, you don't see a word about it. Nobody talks about it.
Yeah, it is really incredible. That I guess people are just happy. Hey, look, we watch our football games now. It's the NFL coming up with the playoffs. I watched yesterday some college football, drank a little wine, and enjoyed life. And why do we have to be worried about this stuff? I guess it's we don't want to know about it, and life is better not to know. But in any event, this whole idea, Oliver Stone, is another piece that was written on the Ron Paul Institute for Peace and Prosperity. CIA fingerprints are all over the Ukraine. Now, before I ask you to comment on that article, Daniel, I'd like to just ask you, where do you think, post-World War II, where do you think the United States intervention has worked out for the better of the nations involved that we've intervened in? I mean, there might be some. Maybe Europe, maybe Japan. I don't know, but we're still in those countries, aren't we?
Yeah, it's still a work in progress 70 years later, 60 years later.
Yeah.
I think supporters of intervention would say, well, we're not allowed to know about all of these wonderful successes.
Why not?
But why not?
Why wouldn't we? Why wouldn't we want to champion them?
Yeah,
Why wouldn't the propagandists want to champion them?
Exactly. I mean, I wish we could point to one place where things have turned out better. But even if you, I mean, everywhere you look even at a place like Serbia, where we took we claimed this great victory in getting rid of the dictator Milosevic. But are the Serbians any better off now than they were under Milosevic? Is the average Serbian better off than he was before then? No, he's not. Serbia was not attacking the U.S., yet we went in and attacked that country, and the place is worse off. The economy is as bad, if not worse, than it was before. You could go look at in Central America, look at all through the 1980s, the U.S. interventions. Have they resulted in anything positive? No. We've seen in the Confessions of an Economic Hitman, who you've mentioned several times, that the real beneficiary of these interventions is usually well-connected individuals and corporations who go in and cash in. We see a lot of that in Ukraine. Look, the vice president's own son has gone into Ukraine and is cashing in on their petrochemical industry,
Sure.
on their fracking industry there.
Sure.
So
Sure.
this is how it works.
Sure. So I guess the key is, when you said the average person in these countries don't fare better, same could be held true, of course, in the United States. The average person is not faring better with a less free, less libertarian government, and more intrusive government in every area of our lives, including the tax man and the inflationist out of the Federal Reserve. But this is the way the world is these days. It just seems to me that Americans need to wake up, and that's, of course, why we talk to you about these things, to try to understand what's really going on in the foreign policy realm. And so this article also appears on your website, on the Ron Paul Institute for Peace and Prosperity website. Oliver Stone is drawing some conclusions about the CIA and its involvement, its interventionist involvement in the Ukraine. Would you care to comment on that briefly, Daniel?
Sure, and I wrote this piece up briefly, and the news was out a few days ago that he was in Russia. He's working on a film about Ed Snowden, and in the process he's doing a side project about Ukraine, and he interviewed the deposed President Yanukovych and got some more information. And I think one of the main points that he made, and I should probably preface this by saying I hesitate somewhat in citing anyone from Hollywood and any supposed expert from Hollywood, but I think that Stone is an interesting and independent thinker, and it doesn't mean I endorse everything he says, but I still think when someone of his stature says something, it's worth considering. But apparently he went and he has doing his investigation for a film that he's making, and his main point is about these mysterious snipers and assassins that appeared on the Maidan, on the protest square, on I think the 20th through the 22nd of February, and this was really the catalyzing event for the coup, where the U.S. claimed immediately after these mysterious snipers began shooting people that were protesting and shooting police officers, that this was Yanukovych's thugs. And it just shows what a horrible, ruthless person he is, that he would send his thugs in to kill all of these protesters. And of course this has been the case, and Stone points this out, this has been the case in several other coups and coup attempts that the U.S. CIA has been involved in, notably in Venezuela several years ago, when there was this mysterious shooting from office towers on people in the street. So this is a component of these violent regime change operations. And he said that the evidence that he's seen now suggests that the people who were doing this shooting were not, they were third-party elements. They were outside third-party agitators who were doing this. They were not police officers, and they were not protesters. And he says this kind of action, in his experience in covering a lot of these things over the years, has CIA fingerprints all over it. So I think that's quite interesting.
Yeah, well, it really is, and I think it's also very interesting, the idea that he's going to be doing a movie on Ed Snowden. I really look forward to that. But as you say, you're hesitant to fully endorse Hollywood, because I think you have to be always suspicious. But at least if there are people out there that are saying things that are somewhat different than the establishment, then it's worth listening to or considering, I suppose.
Yeah.
But I still, I just keep thinking about this over and over again, how Alan Greenspan told your boss or remarked about some questions your boss, some pretty heavy-duty questions he was asking, and Bernie Sanders on the left side of the political spectrum asking Alan Greenspan and Chairman Oxley apologized for their behavior, for their irreverent questions towards Alan Greenspan, and Alan Greenspan said, "Well, this is what makes America great. We have dissension." So you can have the appearance of dissension. You can have an Oliver Stone going in there and asking questions, and then you can sit back and say, "Well, look how free we are. Look how free we are."
Exactly.
So I think you always have to, it's just, it's nothing really is the way it seems to be. The older I get, the more I realize that you can't trust what you see on the surface. Daniel, I would ask you maybe just before we conclude our discussion today, America's military industrial complex that Eisenhower warned us about as he was leaving office in the early 50s, it just keeps growing and growing, doesn't it? And the establishment and the bureaucracy and the enormous amount of building and construction in Washington, D.C. continues to grow and grow, not only because of the military-industrial complex, but that's a big part of it, but just government keeps getting bigger and bigger. What do you think in terms of military spending going forward? It seems to me, and I read Richard Mayberry, his excellent newsletter, which he, I guess, picked up from your boss many years ago when Dr. Paul re-entered Congress. Mayberry is of the opinion that this is unstoppable, that the U.S. military, and he outlines all these things that you and I talk about, that we're going to, and he gets into the various hardware and the things that are being developed, and Obama's pivot to Asia, the TPP that he's pushing forward, and how we're going to have to build up our military, our Navy in that part of the world to compete and to continue to dominate over China. Anyway, the long story short is Mayberry believes, and he's done very well, recommending stocks of the military-industrial complex, even though he is in sympathy with your views, my views, Ron Paul's views. He is a libertarian, a free market guy. He's just saying this is the way things are. We can't stop it. So he is going forward and looking to profit from this, what I consider to be an evil enterprise. But how do you see it? Do you see the military-industrial complex just growing without hesitation here?
Well, I think as Dr. Paul has always said, this will have to stop at some point, and it'll stop when we are bankrupt. And I think you know much better than I do, Jay. We've seen a lot of very interesting things happen over this past year. The de-dollarization of the world, for example, and this has been I think it's an unintended consequence of the U.S. sanctions policy around the world. These countries that find themselves under sanctions are having to look for alternative ways of trading with each other, with the dollar being out of their grasp. And so while the U.S. is foolishly believing that it's forcing the rest of the world to follow its dictate by sanctioning everyone in sight, what it's actually doing is creating the seeds of its own destruction.
Yeah.
So it's very interesting.
It sure seems to be that way. When I read independent views instead of the propaganda from the United States about what's going on in Russia, I don't think Putin and Russia is as bad off as they are portrayed to be. Their economy is as bad off. I just saw today that Russia has sold a record amount of oil into the international markets. Of course, the oil prices are low as a result of various factors, I suppose. But one of the things that people don't seem to realize is that with the Russian ruble being slammed down much lower, it makes the cost of production low for the Russian producers and actually encourages them to sell more oil. So, there's unintended consequences, and I just think these guys aren't thinking them through, or somebody is, the policymakers are just doing whatever the people that own them are telling them to do, I suppose. But one of the things I've decided to do, and I'll just pass this along to my listeners here, and I've told my subscribers to do, I believe that Mayberry is right, that probably you can continue to make money in some of these defense stocks, although you never know. We could also see a decline in the equity markets this year. I think that's a very real possibility. But what I'm telling people to do, and what I have vowed to do myself, is the extent I buy, and I'm recommending a 7.5% allocation to defense stocks this year. And how could I do that as one who believes this is an immoral activity? Well, I'm saying let's take the profits, if any, from these stocks and donate them to, or at least a portion of them, to the Ron Paul Institute for Peace and Prosperity. So let's take some profits from these goons
Mm-hmm.
and help support the Ron Paul Institute for Peace and Prosperity so that you can continue to tell people what is really going on as opposed to the propaganda that we're getting from the mainstream.
Well, that's very kind of you for offering to support the Institute, Jay, and I really appreciate that. I have mixed feelings because I hope the stocks don't do extremely well. But
yeah, me too.
Certainly, we're very happy to have anyone's support. We're on a shoestring, so
me
little
too.
bit helps.
Yeah, me too, Daniel. I hope they don't do well, and that's why I've got 7.5% of the portfolio in there, a diverse portfolio. So if they don't do well, it's not going to kill me. But if they do well, we'll try to use that as a means of sharing the truth with people, and so people can look at things more objectively.
Thank you, Jay.
I would just tell my listeners, of course, you don't have to wait for profits from the defense stocks to share to help the Ron Paul Institute for Peace and Prosperity get the truth out. You can always go there now and donate. So that's what I would suggest you do. It is tax deduction, isn't it, Daniel?
Yes, indeed, a 501c3.
Yeah. So you can, it's not as costly as you might think, and also, of course, you're going to be doing a lot of good, in my view, by letting people know the truth about what's really going on. Thank you again, Daniel, for being with us again, and I look forward to doing it again next week.
Thank you so much, Jay.
That's it for now, folks. Until next week, goodbye, and God's blessings to you.